Ochelli Effect is sponsored by WallStreetWindow.com and listeners like you.
And now, the most underrated voice in all media, Chuck Ochelli.
April 17, 2024, allegedly, according to that thing we call a calendar. This is indeed the Ochelli Effect, and I am live on a Wednesday, middle of the week, hump day, whatever you want to call it. But most of you will catch this further on down the stream, etc., because we are also a podcast, the Ochelli Effect, that is. I'm not a podcast, although sometimes I play one on your device of choice. Anyway, it is what it is. It is Wednesday. This day in history, in fact, is relevant to tonight's discussion. And my returning co-host once again for the evening, Larry Hancock, who is the author on many, many, many subjects, often revolving around the intelligence reactions, the United States reactions, the geopolitical spheres of influence, many, many things aside from the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which, oh, by the way, we might have to discuss here because the Bay of Pigs happened 63 years ago. Now, all your numerology people might be going 63 years ago for the thing that happened in 1963, and then you're going to tell me which parallel it occurred on and what time of day it actually was on the clock according to the sundial. Let's calm down, everybody, and get some real context from Larry Hancock about this. And while you're at it, check out Larry's work. Takes up a lot of space on my bookshelf, etc., etc. And it doesn't just take up space or collect dust, because it's very useful stuff and some of the best stuff out there. From surprise attack, shadow warfare. You might think that something like the Bay of Pigs would get mentioned in those books, and indeed I'm sure they do, as well as in Tipping Point, as well as in Someone Would Have Talked. Maybe not in Unidentified, because I don't remember any sort of unidentified flying objects. At least, maybe there were some in the rooms in D.C. when things were occurring. But I don't think there were unidentified flying objects at the Bay of Pigs, this location near Cuba. Of course, we're back to talking about Cuba and what might have been involved there. And many people discuss it and reference it when talking about the assassination. Oh, by the way, did I mention Tipping Point? Did I mention Someone Would Have Talked? Did I mention that Larry has many other books out there, either authored or co-authored by him? The Awful Grace of God, Killing King, one, an update of the other. This kind of stuff. So that assassination, various interactions, UAPs, which we have discussed recently on the show, a wide variety of topics where you get some very clean, good, solid analysis from a man who I'm satisfied to call not only an author but a historian. I don't think you technically have that training per se, but all the work you've done, you've definitely laid out a historical set of references. And all of them valuable. I recommend all of them highly. Oh, and indeed, you might want to look at a detailed discussion of the Bay of Pigs in a book called In Denial, which you might recognize that title because I do run a spot almost every show that comes through this network for that book, authored by Larry Hancock. And I happen to have a copy of that and, well, every one of Larry's books. And I'm looking forward to the new one, which I'm not sure when it's coming out. Maybe Larry can help us and fill us in as to when that might be presentable. But a new book taking another look at Lee Harvey Oswald. When is that due to come out, Larry? And how you doing tonight, by the way?
Oh, I'm fine, Chuck. I certainly hope that the Oswald book will be out by the end of the year. I hope it will be out by the time of the Lancer conference in November. We have the going into the final edit with Rex right now, but of course then there's proofreading, there's publishing, but the writing part is essentially done. So that's a relief. And turned out there were only 427 footnotes, so people can really look forward to that too.
Oh, there you go. 427 footnotes. I mean, Larry, what are you getting lazy? I mean, what's going on here? And by the way, I believe that outnumbers the number of pages, and I'm obviously busting your chops. But I look forward to that as well as looking forward to Lancer, which we'll both be participating in this coming year. Although, as it stands right now, I am planning on being there in person to MC and maybe do some other things. And you may or may not be there in person. That's still not fully decided, I guess. But looks like either way, you'll be presenting somehow, though, whether it's virtually or in person. You're going to do that. And probably participate in the online situation. Maybe I heard a rumor that you might actually, I don't know, be running the little Facebook group that they have as the live conference is happening. Something like that. Maybe I heard wrong. You could tell us later, because all we know right now is the dates, which coincidentally, speaking of this day in history, are going to line up rather nicely because it's going to begin this year on the 22nd, as far as we're planning thus far. So the weekend of the 22nd to the 24th in November, the Lancer Conference will happen. And if you're watching it online or you're there in person, you'll be suffering through me in person, but you'll get Larry Hancock either virtually or maybe we'll have a live connection with you even if you're from a remote location. Still to be determined what you're going to do exactly, right?
Yeah. Depends on how early the book is and whether I survive the publishing. Yeah, one never knows. It's like giving birth, but I've done it a few times now, so I know what's coming up.
Well, there you go. So we will sit in anticipation and see exactly what participation you'll have, but you will be involved with Lancer this year one way or another. So we have that to look forward to. Only, it's about 7 months away now. But before we get there, let's talk about this day in history, just briefly, and of course only one event, April 17, right? Now, I hear this referenced constantly when people do podcasts, when people do presentations, documentaries. It is worthy of mention when you're going to discuss the assassination of John F. Kennedy or the time period. It is a watershed event. Some interesting things occur in the face of the public, not the face of the public really, but in the public's view that quite often didn't used to occur in the public's view. How would you approach this if somebody's like, look, I've heard of the Bay of Pigs, but I don't know much. Think it happened in Cuba. I heard that once from somebody. I think that happened in Cuba. And that was the extent of what they had heard about it. Not somebody who was, extremely interested in all of the minutia of the Kennedy assassination, obviously, but a general kind of introduction. How would you introduce not only the historical event to someone who might not be read in on it, but also how would you explain the context as to why it is of note regarding the assassination, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, obviously without speculating, just in a very general, pedestrian, easily accessible way, Larry. What would you say about the Bay of Pigs for somebody who's only familiar with the phrase, let's say?
Yeah, I think one of the problems that we face from an historical standpoint is we fight the same problem with the discussion of the Bay of Pigs that we do with the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. What is written about both in the history books is very minimalist. You often find, a paragraph of, when the assassination happened in Dallas, Lee Harvey Oswald, the lone shooter, and you're done. The same thing goes with the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs was essentially a landing of a Cuban force at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. It was a disaster. Over some 3 days, the force was essentially landed successfully and operated for a day and a half successfully, and then was basically overwhelmed. And it was an immense political disaster for a brand new president, President Kennedy. And when it's talked about, that's the way it's talked about. It's sort of like it was Kennedy's first trial by fire. It was a disaster, and it sets a very negative tone for the administration, which he later came back with during the missile crisis. But in the history books, it's presented as a Kennedy disaster based on Kennedy's decision making. Unfortunately, as with the JFK assassination, which we've learned far more about over the decades, that's not as simple as it is in the history book, and neither is the Bay of Pigs, is it?
Right. So let me interrupt you.
The basic backstory for the Bay of Pigs.
Well, let me interrupt you. Let me just interrupt you real quick for one reason only, because we require quick snapshots here of two things. One, the event itself, but also let's put into context the idea that in real time and ever after, according to history, you have the figure of Fidel Castro, who is a person of interest, clearly somebody that you have to mention when you're discussing the Cold War in general, et cetera, et cetera. So it goes far beyond the Kennedy assassination. And you'd have to say that, you know, regardless of whether it was during those days when the news reports were happening and Kennedy gives the famous press conference where it basically says, you know, I'm going to very badly paraphrase here. The buck stops here. I'm responsible for this mess, etc. He says that in public, but there's a public and private occurrence here. And it's in the context of the height of the Cold War, before the Cuban Missile Crisis, seen as a victory, for the administration, for America in general. So there's a context of what was going on then and how it has been carried out through history, as you said, with really not even a full paragraph, a few sentences in a lot of history books. So you have to kind of land those two things before you even get into the description, don't you?
Absolutely. And you've got a key point there on it's 3 days. And it's always, when it's described as the Bay of Pigs landings, 3 days, when in essence, the operation was initiated by President Eisenhower the year before. Mm-hmm. The operation is approved and conceived under Eisenhower, was nothing at all similar to what was instituted by the CIA only weeks after JFK had come into office. Mm-hmm. But that backstory is never given. Nobody ever writes about, the Bay of Pigs as part of a much longer Cuba project that had been, it's 3 days compared to what had actually been in play for over a year. And without the backstory of what Eisenhower had authorized, what came about, what Kennedy had authorized, which was actually nothing at all similar to what actually happened at the Bay of Pigs. You're left hanging, as we often are with the JFK assassination, with only a very small part of the story. And I think that's one of the things that makes it important, that we can learn a lot from the Bay of Pigs in terms of educating ourselves of how the sound bites in the history books are really not helpful for understanding what happened historically. And if that's all you ever read, and if that's what you just repeat, then it's wrong. You're making a mistake. Everybody's making a mistake. Yet I will say, 63 years after the fact, articles are being written in papers around the nation about the Bay of Pigs, and they continue to recite a whole set of things that are false, that took us quite a while to learn, but they're repeated year after year after year simply because that was what was said in the beginning, and it never gets any more accurate, which is definitely frustrating for historians and anybody that would really like to understand the real story. But right. The newspaper, it's easy. They just pick up the copy. And the copy is extremely negative because that's the way people were talking about it immediately afterwards.
Well, and much like, any real-time news story, there's also remnants of things that do get retained over time, like the introduction of Richard Nixon into the conversation, because he was the officer of the White House who was given responsibilities regarding this, according to the very what do we call it? The very sort of condensed version of the historical sound bites. Nixon is the executive action officer under Eisenhower. He had knowledge of this. He had more knowledge about it than the president, who was being told about it as he's coming into office, according to, a lot of reports. So there's some context here. You got to think about that. This is during that transition and all of it. But this can get confusing. So let's cut through that and get to the event itself, right? We've given a lot of the context and a lot of the cautionary tales about being careful about what was, recorded in public in real time, what we've been able to learn, the arguments over, could he have given air cover? Did he give air cover? Is that really the thing? Did that build resentment? Put it all aside, and let's get to the event itself, if you don't mind. What do you think, Larry? Is that appropriate?
It's appropriate only with one caveat, and that's the fact that what Kennedy actually authorized was the landing of a Cuban force inside Cuba. This force had been prepared over some 10 months. Originally, it had only was supposed to be a very small group of people who were highly trained who would go in and lead a revolution. There was no way what Eisenhower approved was in no way resembling what happened at the Bay of Pigs. And so I think we can talk about what did happen at the Bay of Pigs, which was a literal D-Day style landing craft, tanks, aircraft, transports, paratroops, was in no way what was supposed to have happened. It all morphed literally into something brand new over approximately 4 months at the very end of the Eisenhower administration. And Kennedy basically inherited it and asked some questions about it. It's interesting. When Kennedy asked for a brief and actually asked whether or not the Joint Chiefs of Staff had approved it as a military action, he was told no, they hadn't. And he said, well, then let's send them over the plan and let them take a look at it. And the answer was, well, there's no plan. There's no written plan. We have nothing to send them. This is a denial operation. It's all verbal. Well, okay, go ahead and brief them. And when you read the documents, it's kind of like the Joint Chiefs people are going, we're not even sure. We have to talk to these people, and they're telling us bits and pieces, so we're going to give you an opinion. But it's not like they've given us a well-thought-out plan. And basically all we can tell you is, yeah, it looks like they will be able to land a force. They'll be able to put them on the beach, but it absolutely looks like they do not have a plan in place that would allow them to support them over a long term, that would allow them logistically to do that support. And by the way, the Joint Chiefs recommendation, which went back to the CIA, said two things. A, this is not going to work at all, and the group will literally be wiped out unless there is a massive internal revolution that happens at the same time as the landing. And B, you've got to pull this off in such a fashion that there are absolutely no Cuban aircraft operating over the beach that can target those landing ships, because you're only putting a small number of ships in there. They're loaded with ammunition, and if you don't have total air control, call it off. So that just sets you a little context for what happened during the next 3 days after the landing, which was totally in violation of all the warnings that the CIA had been given.
Right. And again, for context, this is beyond, because a lot of people just imagine it as the great invasion that is meant to be, okay, there's an invasion, boom, done. The idea here, although there wasn't a formal plan, it seems like, was for a revolution to be sparked. This was meant to be an inciting incident beyond the invasion. Like, the invasion is almost a secondary thing. It is the landing of the parties there. But what they're supposed to do is create a popular uprising. And that's really the key here. And yet, am I correct in thinking there was no specific plan for doing that from what we can discern, or is it possible?
It was actually worse than that, Chuck.
Okay.
And by the way, for people that I'm not really making this stuff up, this all came up. There were, as you can imagine, numerous inquiries, investigations, histories done internally within the CIA, which were extremely damning to the people in charge within the CIA. But literally, in the month before the landings, the CIA became aware that Castro had essentially rolled up the major revolutionary groups on the island, had penetrated them either killed their leaders or locked them up, and there were literally thousands of people in jail at that point that might have helped with the popular revolution, and the CIA absolutely knew that was not going to happen, and they did not even bring it up as an issue to the president. We find that in the transcripts of the meetings, and not only did they not do that, but the people that they had trained over the better part of the year to infiltrate and lead that sort of revolutionary action were not inserted either. And even some of the most basic things that you would do, like put these people in as pathfinders, have them block roads in the interior, blow up bridges, none of those people were even deployed with the landing. So, to answer your question, it's not an overstatement to say that the major part of the plan, which relied upon an internal revolution. In fact, the plan even called for sending in hundreds of thousands of rounds of ammunition to support this revolution. It was not even that the picture at the time of the landings, and the CIA officer in charge, Richards Bissell and Tracy Barnes, knew that and were aware of it and just weren't telling anybody.
Well, in fact, one of the leading figures that was imagined to basically take over if Castro's overthrown, at least one of them was not even in the country or near the country at the time, which I find interesting. But here's the thing. The postmortem gets even weirder.
Pass it on that note, Chuck, just to expand on that.
Sure.
The CIA actually locked up all of the major revolutionary leaders that were inside the United States.
Right.
That, again, you would expect, if this is going to be a popular revolution, you've got to have people that the Cuban populace identifies with, recognizes, participating with this. You don't want them on the beat. You want them there. No, they're all locked up in a motel room in Miami because somebody's concerned that they're going to talk and give away the operation.
Right. And the postmortem. One last note on the postmortem, and is often pointed to, is that this leads to, they often say, oh, he fired the head of the CIA and various other people, etc. We know those names. We know who they were. But Kennedy didn't fire them. He asked for their resignations and got them. Key figure there, biggest name key figure anyway, who plays a role later on in this entire narrative and even into the assassination and into the days of the Warren Commission, Allen Dulles. Not only that, but the brother of the mayor of Dallas, who has a CIA building named after him when you're leaving town, which I noted walking to the Greyhound station in Dallas, Cabell, right? You got Earl Cabell and Charles Cabell. Charles, somebody who is involved with the CIA, seemingly asked to offer resignation along with Dulles and some others. But he's got a building named after him, a CIA building in Dallas, right there on that same strip where the Greyhound bus station is. I noted that because I took a look up and realized I was standing in front of the Charles Cabell CIA building. And that's part of the story as well, but often one of the things that people focus on that takes us away from the historical event a little bit, but is significant, or what do you think?
I think it's significant only that, nobody ever asked the question. Nobody really explores what Dulles or Cabell or what the officers did or didn't do. The discussion is always in terms of Kennedy. Right. What did Kennedy do or not do? Which means the only blame for the whole thing is placed on Kennedy. There really is no discussion. You read a biography of Dulles, or you read something about there's nothing in there about associated with the disaster at the Bay. It's missing. So to me, it's just another part of the missing piece of the puzzle that didn't get any discussions. And if you actually read the historical reports, the CIA historical reports, or the commission that studied the Bay of Pigs, you would see what these people didn't do. And it's just, it's amazing what they didn't do. Actually, Kennedy was more than graceful in simply offering to let them resign. Both of them, if they had been in the military and you looked at what they did and what they didn't do, would have been court-martial offenses, dereliction of duty. I mean, there is just absolutely no doubt about it. Cabell, give an example in that regard. Kennedy authorized a whole bunch of things that are never talked about during the 3 days of the landings that he had said no to before. And when it became clear how bad things were going on the beachhead, he authorized airstrikes by American pilots, which he had initially ordered not to happen. He authorized airdrops by Air Force aircraft. And Cabell was supposed to take care of that and did not. It's just amazing. Kennedy authorizes first on day 2, well, actually day 1, day 2, airstrikes by American pilots flying B-26 aircraft, and then he authorizes air cover from the Navy. And the Navy screwed up both of them. They got their timing wrong, communications wrong. They weren't even using the same frequencies as the landing force was. It's just, but the fact is, on the anniversary, none of that will ever be discussed by anybody except here, because it will all be a regurgitation of Kennedy's, failure of decisiveness somehow, because he didn't go ahead and order a full military invasion of Cuba.
Well, and that's the way it stands. So how is it we should interpret this, put this in its right context, the event itself? Let's go into that. I mean, do we need to get into the reference? I mean, we've mentioned the landing. Go ahead.
The simple explanation is that this whole project was not run by Dulles. It was not run by Cabell. It was really run by Tracy Barnes and Richard Bissell. These were the 2 senior operations officers that were given the project. And it was a very unusual organizational thing within the CIA. In fact, it received heavy criticism because it was not the way they normally did things. But these guys were given the mission because they had been in charge of a very successful overthrow of Arbenz in Guatemala years before. And they were felt to be the best on hand for, regime change. They got into this, and basically for the better part of 8 months, Barnes and Bissell put together what was supposed to be an infiltration program, land people in Cuba, take leadership role of these revolutionary groups. And the whole thing was actually, you mentioned Richard Nixon, the whole thing was supposed to result in the overthrow of Castro before the elections. And Nixon would have a shoe-in, the Eisenhower administration would have had a very victory. Actually, both Eisenhower and Nixon were appalled when they found out that nothing was on schedule and nothing had happened in the way that they had been promised. It was an immense shock to them. And at that point in time, since the first, call it Plan 1, if you will, Plan 1 clearly was way too late. Castro had managed to arm himself far better. The Soviets were beginning to ship in everything up to jet fighters. They did a quick reset and built an entirely new plan and trained an entirely new force over some 4 months. October, November, December, January, they totally shifted the plan to this full-scale invasion with landing craft and tanks and heavy weapons groups and paratroopers, which was totally different than what it had been. This was all essentially a kind of a Hail Mary, with Bissell and Barnes recrafting the whole thing into something that might work and at least stood a chance, so they didn't have to admit, back off and admit failure. And one of the things we see in the documentations, when Kennedy took over, again and again, he asked Bissell if he just wanted to drop the whole thing. like, it looks like this is really challenging. Looks like there are real issues. The Joint Chiefs have some problems. Just tell me no, and it's okay. We'll back off it. And they would not do that. Bissell and Barnes would not do that. In fact, really the upshot and what kind of wraps it all together is decades after the fact, a very good author and reporter showed documents that discussed this whole process to the two actual military officers who were in charge of the Cubans, who were in charge of field operations with the Cubans, Hawkins and Easterline. And they showed them to them, including what Kennedy had been told, what he had not been told, what commitments, etc. And their immediate reaction was Bissell was lying to Kennedy and he was lying to us at the same time. We don't know what in the world was in his head, but, these guys had walked into Bissell's home and said they were resigning weeks before the landing because the whole thing was nonsense unless they got, major extensive support, more aircraft, more air raids, and Bissell persuaded them not to resign, and he would go to Kennedy and get what they needed. Absolutely committed to them. Right. What we now know he did was to go to Kennedy and actually cut the request for air power.
Right. Now,
and even the day of the landing, he refused to argue for more airstrikes.
Right. Now, look, this is a key thing. And just in the show notes, you'll see that I've provided some references to the JFK library about the Bay of Pigs and also the CIA.gov's official story about this. Why do I present this? Because after we study documentation and go through a whole bunch of things, as Larry is describing, you find that, the story that is generally told, not unfairly, but in an incomplete fashion, is that Kennedy was misled regarding this. But it seems as though so was Nixon. So were other members of the CIA. So were military. It seems as though there was a whole lot of misleading going on here. And it was done, what I can read, with the intention of causing people to have to react, to add more things into the mix, to add more resources, more reactions in real time because they would sort of be cornered into doing so. And you presented it, or the people that were in charge, presented it as something that was well taken care of. But at the same time, it goes further because, as you said, Kennedy authorizes some things. Others might have authorized some things. And then these guys don't even take advantage of that which could have been helpful to the overall plan, which, again, on paper was an incomplete plan. But somebody had to have had an idea in mind here. I mean, I'm sure they didn't just throw it at the wall and say, let's see what happens. I'm sure it'll turn out good, to take it to the street level. I'm sorry, Larry, but, I mean, that's the story that's emerging here.
We have a very concrete example of that. It's not that we don't have, unfortunately, the Cubans, who were awesome fighters and did everything they possibly could after having been landed, were not aware. They had not been told the full story, partially because the CIA officers had not been told, in charge of them, hadn't been told the full story either. Give a very simple example. Grayston Lynch, who was one of the leaders at the landing, actually the American leader at the landing, and went in with the group,
right.
Wrote a book, which was a very good book in terms of what he understood was supposed to happen, which we now know was in no way what Kennedy had authorized. But just a very simple example is Kennedy had given a direct, explicit order that in terms of deniability, the whole landing had to be accomplished in darkness. And that all the ships, the landing ships, supply ships, troop ships, everything would be outside of Cuba's national waters by daybreak. Mm-hmm. Which, from his standpoint, would make, we're just here to land these people. We insert them. If things go wrong, they'll go guerrilla, which he had been promised and they weren't trained for or equipped for. But he had set that standard because everybody knew that the ships could be setting ducks. for the Cuban Air Force if they had survived, which, by the way, Bissell knew that a good part of the Cuban Air Force was still operational. Okay.
Right.
Those ships were the ones that were hit by the Cuban aircraft, exploded. The main ammunition carrier exploded. The others fled for their lives, and their captains refused to ever bring them back to the beachhead. The ships were not run by the brigade itself. They were commercial ships that had been volunteered by a Cuban owner of a fleet of ships. They were not really, they were just brought in separate from the brigade. But Lynch said in his book, it's sort of like, we never expected that we could have the landing done by daylight. That was never part of the plan. We had tanks to unload. We had armored trucks to unload, heavy weapons. It's insane. No, nobody ever mentioned that to us. Yet the president's directive was explicit that was to happen. So there's a whole breakdown between what Kennedy set as requirements, what the officers in the field were expecting. It was an operational nightmare as far as command and control goes.
Right, and it's a back and forth of people not informing others, whether they're in charge, not in charge on the ground. They're simply not being informed the whole way. This complete ball of miscommunication, which, I'm assuming the majority of it is intentional. I guess you could put some of it off on the incompetence, side of the board. But, I mean, honestly, it seems as though it's intentional in order to cause certain events to occur. And I don't think failure was the thing that anybody involved had in mind. I don't think there was an intentional failure here. This was meant to cause something else.
Know, Chuck, and here's what really clouds that question. We have learned only relatively recently that Bissell had 3 different things going that might have changed this whole picture. Mm-hmm. At first, something we did know about before, he had an assassination plot in play to poison Castro, which almost worked, and then another assassination plot to take him out with a sniper team. Mm. If you'd taken Castro out of the equation, it would have been an entirely different thing. Bissell, only half a dozen people knew about these things, and Bissell was the one running them. The other thing was that they had used the Navy base at Guantanamo to move in a massive amount of explosives and to stage what can only be interpreted as a false flag attack on Guantanamo. Mm. If that had happened and the Navy had intervened to defend Guantanamo massively, it would have been all over, because the third thing we know is that Bissell had made an arrangement with the commander of the Atlantic Fleet to put a carrier task group off of Cuba that nobody told Kennedy about.
Right.
This was a massive task force. And if Guantanamo had indeed been attacked in a false flag, and that carrier group had been activated by the admiral, who said he was in his notes, which I've read, said he was totally prepared to do this, then it would have been over in 3 days. The Navy jets were equipped with everything they needed, including air-to-ground weaponry, to take out the entire Castro military.
Just to
Kennedy
make this, absolutely,
nothing about this.
In the interest of absolute clarity, just to get this very straight, there is a group of assets sitting off of the shores of Cuba, of U.S. assets, fully prepared to back militarily, to launch further attacks, prepared, sitting there, waiting. We did not know about this until very recently. In my mind, I don't think historians knew it. It was not part of the general conversation. Is that true or false?
That is true. And it only was revealed to us by like a couple of articles in Navy publications, mm-hmm. the oral history written by this admiral, and a couple of comments from people serving in the ships that had come up over time. Even the command ship for the landing force. Okay, this one Kennedy knew it was out there, the carrier Essex. Years later, people on the ship, personnel were commenting that one of the things that's surprising is that a group of carrier ground attack aircraft, including all the weapons that they needed for a large-scale ground attack campaign, had been loaded on that ship offshore, very covertly. Now, if you look at what Kennedy had authorized, there's no way that U.S. Navy jets were ever going to be ordered or allowed to conduct, ground attacks across Cuba with those kind of weapons. So somebody had that in mind. I would propose Bissell had it in mind. So I'm just inserting this to say, things that look intentional as versus stupid may not be quite as wild if certain of these other things had happened. These are wild cards that Bissell had in his pocket. None of them worked for different reasons, but is that what made him make stupid mistakes because he thought he still had cards to play? I have no idea. What I do know is that even the night that the landing group was launched, that it sailed, he and Cabell were given the opportunity to talk to Kennedy and argue for more air attacks, and they chose not to do so. And when someone asked him, well, is this not dangerous? And he said, well, the only thing I would have been able to tell the president is, there is a possibility that we could have lost, ships in the landing group. Like, wait a minute, that's all the ships you got. You don't have any more. That's all the ammunition you've got. There are no plans to resupply any of that. If you lose it, it's all over. He's a smart guy. He knows that. So it's like one of the dumbest answers you could possibly expect. Is that because he knew more? Or is it because he just was so egotistical? Or, is he a person who thinks that he's always going to win? I don't know.
And you do go into a deep discussion of this in the book In Denial, correct? Because
yes,
and just
all those elements, including the other carrier group and the false flag, and there's other things that he may have had in play.
Right. All of this is described in detail in the book In Denial, Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks, which I'm also going to provide you guys the link to. And as a matter of fact, as we go to a break here, because I want to take a break for a moment, let people digest this, that the assets to further this entire circumstance were available, but due to miscommunications and some unknown factors were not implemented, were not utilized. And what do we end up with at the end? Well, we're going to find out about that from Larry Hancock after we take a little break. But in the meantime, you can always study for yourself by going and picking up Larry's book, checking out some of the articles that I'm going to attach to the show notes, and all of that, because further study is necessary here regarding this event that is given short shrift by most documentary filmmakers, podcasters, and even authors about John F. Kennedy, whether they're talking about the assassination or simply the administration. Either way,
this is James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and you're listening to The Ochelli Effect at Ochelli.com.
In Denial, Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks by Larry Hancock. Secret wars became a staple of U.S. covert operations and are still happening today. Larry Hancock's book, In Denial, rips the cover off many of them. Using new files, it exposes things about the Bay of Pigs that no one has ever written about before. It shows why it really failed and why the United States did not learn from it. It also shows why other countries today are doing secret operations with more success. This is the book that puts what some want to deny into the light. In Denial, Secret Wars with Airstrikes and Tanks. Larry Hancock. For more information, go to larry-hancock.com. Pick up your copy of In Denial at Amazon.com in digital or physical form.
The War State by Michael Swanson explains the great national transformation that took place and put the Kennedy presidency in the context of the times and reveals never-before published information about the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy would not have been assassinated if he had been president 200 years ago. His assassination took place in the context of the Cold War and the rise of the national security state. Before World War II, the United States was a continental republic. In the decade that followed, it became an imperial superpower. Generals such as Curtis LeMay not only wanted to invade Cuba, but knew that there were short-range missiles on the island armed with nuclear warheads that they could not destroy because they were on mobile launchers. Their invasion could have led to a third world war, and they wanted to go to war anyway. The War State by Michael Swanson reveals why and will show you what President Kennedy was up against. For more information, thewarstate.com.
Uncle, do you remember that time when Benjamin Fulford said that an Asian secret society was going to dispatch ninjas to take down the Illuminati?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, in the cartoon.
Yeah, did that ever work out too good?
No.
It didn't, did it?
Didn't work.
But here on Ochelli.com radio network, things work out a bit better, don't they?
Much better. I mean, it's clearer in understanding about the programs. The programs are much clearer. Getting live people into it. They really have a good conversation going.
Much better.
Much better scene.
I say forget Benjamin Fulford and his ninjas and listen to the Ochelli.com radio network.
I agree. It's straight to the point.
Straight talk.
And I like that idea.
Ochelli.com.
Does this world get you down? Are you living your bliss? Tired of therapies that don't offer you any real direction or answers? Did you know that Maria does personal life coaching sessions? Save thousands of therapy dollars and get the direction and answers you need to live an authentic life based on your own personal blueprint for this life. All this typically in just one private session with Maria, not countless hours on a couch. Maria combines her professional experience, life experience, and her heredity intuitive gifts to get you back on track. Email Maria today for an appointment at maria@maria.net. That's MERIA@MERIA.net. Get on with the best life you can possibly have. Check out the other side of this happy, loving, passionate woman at www.mariaheller.com and avail yourself of the best coaching around, all in the privacy of your home via the telephone. Gift yourself with yourself. Make an appointment today. Write Maria@maria.net.
The views expressed by callers, co-hosts, or anyone else who happens to get on the air at Ochelli.com do not necessarily reflect the views of Ochelli.com or Chuck Ochelli, and we are not responsible for any stupidity which might ensue. Thank you.
Revelation through conversation.
Let them know. Let them know. Let them know. Got to let them know. I'm bringing all shock like a tear rock, sipping Bud Light at the drag show. I'm bringing all shock like a tear rock, sipping Bud Light at the drag show. Erroneous method, the world's worst professional provocateur. Hit them like it's 2000 something and Beck is back on tour. He never really wanted me anyway. Alcohol turns me into your enemy. I'm Yosemite Sam with some Hennessy. I used to think that bottle was the remedy. Picked it up once or twice after I let it go, but finally had to let it be. I used to roll with a fat bitch. She would give me a left tip for some literacy. I mean literally, not figuratively. I mean literally. We all want chances, we take separate stances, but learn to let it go. We learn to let it go. Oh, we take control. Heroes. It's okay if they have flaws. I wouldn't have stayed sober without Sam Tripoli.
Ochelli.com.
Get ready for the Ochelli effect.
And And finishing out this Wednesday edition of the Ochelli Effect, discussing the Bay of Pigs, which happened on this day, April 17th, in 1961. Okay? But it is currently April 17, 2024, according to all those things called calendars. And, the Bay of Pigs invasion. Again, it happened on this day. It began on this day. But it went on for a while, too. The invasion itself, as Larry points out, the planning. And we've discussed what was happening in the time of the invasion, in the time of the landing, whatever it is you want to call it. But now I think it's appropriate to get to, well, what was the end result? What actually occurred at the end, despite the fact that there's a battle group waiting to join in, despite the fact that the president didn't authorize that? It's sitting and waiting. There's many things about what the president authorized, what he didn't authorize, what was going on. But okay, Larry, how does this event shake out? And let's talk about the aftermath, if you don't mind. What is it people need to take away from it?
Let's talk about the conclusion, and then, as you say, the aftermath, because it's really two different things.
Yes.
Unfortunately, the way it ended was Kennedy had, in all the planning sessions, the discussions with the admirals, with Bissell, Kennedy had insisted that if for some reason, the landing failed, that there be a plan for the Navy to evacuate and reland the force. Because in Kennedy's mind, again, the national directive he'd given was simply to land a Cuban force in Cuba and let them essentially fight it out. Okay. So his expectation was that the Navy would be prepared, the troops would be trained. Here's a plan to evacuate them if they can't hold the beach. Okay. And they would be landed someplace else, or they would be prepared to go into conduct guerrilla warfare, especially. You'll see evacuation and guerrilla warfare throughout all of the discussions. What we now know was that there were never any preparations for that. There were no evacuation plans. The troops were never briefed on this. They were not supplied, equipped, or trained or prepared with plans to go into guerrilla warfare, and the landing site really didn't support that. It was physically, especially when the Cubans had time to block the roads coming into it. It was swamps. So neither one of those options were really going to work. So whatever Kennedy had expected as a fallback was never realistic. So at the end, he gave another order which said the Navy is to provide fighter cover to evacuate the troops, and, we'll execute that plan. The Navy jets got there at the wrong time. There was no coordination, no communication with the ground forces. And when actually Lynch discussed that with the Cuban commander on the beach, basically rejected that whole idea. We're here to fight. We'll continue to fight as best we can. And essentially, the majority of the force was taken captive, taken prisoner, and remained in Cuban prison camps for another couple of years. That was the end of the landing. What the aftermath of the landing was, you discussed earlier, Chuck, and it was the press coverage, and it was Kennedy's decision to accept total responsibility, and that's what ended up in the history books. But what didn't end up in the history books is the fact that there was an intense internal CIA investigation of this disaster. And the Inspector General of the CIA looked into it in great detail, interviewed people, and wrote a scathing report on Bissell and Barnes and the fact that this was, dysfunctional, that their chain of command was terrible, just highlighted all these different things. Bissell was so irked by this that he managed to persuade the CIA director to let him write a response. I mean, that never happens. So you had two stories. One was the Inspector General's story was, this is our problem. It wasn't Kennedy's. We totally screwed up this operation. And an apologia from Bissell saying, oh, no, we did everything right. Don't Don't listen to that other guy. That's what's in the historical record, which never gets covered.
Mm-hmm.
But the offshoot of that was that Bissell had the opportunity to talk to Hawkins and Easterline, who were the actual American military commanders of the force. And Bissell got the chance to tell them his story. It was all Kennedy's fault. He didn't listen to me. He wouldn't do the things I asked him to do. And Hawkins and Easterline just became tremendously bitter and actually carried that story down to Florida and started telling the operations people in Florida Bissell's story about how it was all Kennedy's fault. So unfortunately, even the Cuban forces themselves only heard that story. They have never seen or were never told the other story. And so to this day, of course, they developed an extremely hostile attitude. They use the term treason, abandonment, all of these, which is what Hawkins and Easterline got from Bissell and Barnes. And decades later, when they're shown the real documents, they realized and apologized for what they had done. We didn't realize we were telling them a wrong story, but it's way too late. I mean, it was 30 years after the fact. So that's where we are now, really, with the history books, which describe it as Kennedy's disaster, the documents, including the Inspector General report, giving a totally different picture, and the Cuban community and a lot of the CIA group in Miami having Barnes and Bissell's story of Kennedy's screw-up.
Mm. And then, of course, like I said, the public, look at this, and ever after you have the ideas, the combination of ideas that come out. This leads directly into the discussions of E. Howard Hunt long before the alleged deathbed confession, but he wrote a book about it. He made statements about it. He was tied to it. The Watergate guys, right? This comes back up, and what about that? I mean, obviously, there's the press conference that I mentioned where, the president takes responsibility and all this, which clearly the responsibility should lay with whoever's idea it was to completely not have communication function or be so dysfunctional that it's almost laughable. But at the same time, there's more to it, right? And there's still as yet unknown elements to this, isn't there? Or am I mistaken about that?
Oh, well, it becomes a mystery. You covered. It is so stupid that it raised the question of, was this intentional?
Right.
Were they, are they this stupid and this uncoordinated and displayed this much hubris, or is this part of a plan? That remains an open question. To force Kennedy's hand, that's still discussed. Some of the things that we discussed that were not known at the time. I mean, those assassination attempts were not known at the time. That eventually came out through the work of the Church Committee and the HSCA, but that was 15 years after the fact? And it's only more recently that we've learned more about the false flag, what might have been in play there. So, yeah, I guess that it's kind of like Howard Hunt. You mentioned Howard Hunt. Yeah. Howard Hunt was not involved with any of this. He was a political action officer. He knew nothing about any of this, but Howard, of course, claimed to know everything about everything.
Right.
So, Howard just adds more disinformation to the mix. About all he would have known were a couple of names out of JM Wave in Miami, guys who were in operations. And we're doing some support for this, like David Morales. But so it kind of piles on top of each other in terms of mystery after the fact and leaves us chasing our tail. When if you go back to the IG's report and the inquiry into this, which never surfaces, but nobody does. I mean, yes, there have been a couple of books written on that. good books written on that, not just In Denial, but nobody reads them. I mean, they're deep history books, and nobody reads deep history. So those parts never make it really into the discussions that we're interested in. The Bay of Pigs remains a mystery. It remains all Kennedy's fault, or it remains something we'll just puzzle over forever.
Like the only thing that
we don't need to.
Yeah. Well, the only thing that can be agreed upon is that it's a massive failure. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. As to who's responsible for it and everything else, there's open questions. And the open questions have a lot of leading pieces. You know, you have some pretty decent priority suspects here. As for their motivation, though, it's difficult to connect the motivation to it. But it's still relevant even 63 years later. Right? It still is relevant. And does it, the ultimate question, which a lot of people who listen to my show might have, is does this have any relevance to the assassination, in your opinion? Is it relevant to that discussion in a realistic and direct way? That's the
Certainly it is. Certainly it's relevant to discussion, in my view, of what happened, because it raised the issue of motive. Mm-hmm. There is no doubt that the anti-Castro Cubans regarded JFK's action as treachery and literally leading to the deaths of many of their friends. I mean, this became a very personal thing. And whether that was right or wrong, that was the belief that they were left with. That's what people they trusted told them. And so it established a level of individual bitterness towards JFK that you still see repeated in their remarks. Mm-hmm. And that was a prelude to the missile crisis, where, again, his resolution of that without invading Cuba and without a war just elevated that bitterness. So, yes, in terms of motive, and you know, Chuck, my take on the actual motive behind the attack in Dallas is, I think it's more than relevant, because the story that they were given created the motive of revenge. It created an intense emotional state in people that felt that they had more than adequate reason to take an action against JFK. Mm-hmm. So, in terms of motive and conditioning, I think it's more than relevant to the attack in Dallas.
Right. And I'd like to add an addendum to what you just said. And if you want to object to it, please do. I don't like to add on to what you have to say, but I think this is necessary. Is that even for those that might not wish to entertain the idea that anti-Castro Cubans are the responsible party, the masterminds, the planners, whatever. Here's one thing that I think is beyond argument, and that is that a group of individuals, through various things that happened, including the Bay of Pigs, definitely have one of the best motivators for murder and makes them eligible to be a useful group and have useful individuals within their group for an operation if you wanted to partake of an operation of this kind. And they are a useful group who are probably readily available and at least helpful if you wanted to plan out such an operation. Even if they're not the planners themselves, the anti-Castro Cubans are fully eligible to be, for lack of a better term, in play regarding the attack in Dallas. Do you feel as though that's an adequate or reasonable statement?
No, I think that's quite reasonable. And I think the one thing that has to be added to that is they not only have motive, they not only have emotion, they're not only available to other people who know them, who've worked with them, and if they choose to put this together, know who to talk to, but they are extremely well-trained, extremely proficient. By the time of the Bay of Pigs, there's a cadre who's been trained and been in and out of Cuba. They know infiltration, exfiltration. They're extremely skilled at that. And they are skilled in the tactics of assault and assassination, because some of them have been involved in several attempts, including sniper attacks on Fidel Castro. So we're not just talking about a group of potential candidates. we're talking about a group of highly skilled potential candidates.
So one could easily argue that in the classic framework of means, motive, and opportunity, what you have here is an easy assumption of motive and an easy assumption of means on a lot of levels due to the fact that there was training, access to equipment, access to information, connection to undercover people, intelligence people, underground people, etc., etc. Now, only thing left there is opportunity in the classic structure. And that's it. So 2 out of 3 of the criteria are met regarding an eligible suspect group. And that's something to keep in mind as you go further and as you study this, and that is relevant. Now, does that mean that they absolutely are involved? No. I can't prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt, but who knows, evidence might emerge to that effect, and if it did, at the very least, 2/3 of the 3-pronged or the triad of necessary elements are already attached, easily, observably. So with all that in mind, I urge you guys to go to larry-hancock.com, read the blog that Larry puts out. Obviously, I recommend all of his books. A great discussion about the Bay of Pigs, though, is included in the book In Denial, which you might recognize as one of those things that we do a book commercial for here on Ochelli.com and during podcasts, etc. But not just because he's my friend and he's a great writer, but because you can be educated rather deeply by observing his work, and not just on this case, this subsection of the case, this part of history, 1961, et cetera, but on a lot of things, all the way from unidentified, creating chaos, shadow warfare, the awful grace of God, and one more time, let's mention it, In Denial, which has a lot to do with the failures and the successes and lack of successes by U.S. assets regarding secret wars that are not always so secret, but quite often are, and could involve anything from airstrikes and tanks to flotillas of individuals who are rebels being landed on their native soil in order to retake it, despite whatever the communication is at the moment, or despite whatever assets could be lying in wait. Success or lack thereof is not necessarily ensured as you study the history of the Cold War, the 20th century, the United States in totality. There's a lot to be said and a lot to be studied. And once again, just recognizing that on this day in history, yeah, we're talking about the beginning of the Bay of Pigs and the landing, but there's a lot more to it. The lead up to it, the overall program that the Bay of Pigs was clearly born out of, and the aftermath and residual resonance, which has continued to echo through history. So all of that having been said, any final thoughts, Larry Hancock? Anything else you want to drop on here, or do you think we've covered this pretty well for today?
No, I think we've covered it well, and I think I appreciate doing this, and it's always good to revisit this particular one and try to, I won't say correct the historical record, but maybe expand it a little bit. So I appreciate being on, Chuck.
Clarification, expansion, and addition of real facts, real information, I think is always relevant and good to know, because how are you going to know how to avoid the mistakes of history if you don't know the history to begin with? If it's all kept undercover, how are you ever going to witness what may have been that you don't want to repeat? And also, how is it that you could relive some of the successful efforts in the past if you're not informed? So you can be informed by checking out all the works of Larry Hancock. Again, larry-hancock.com. In weeks coming up, we will be discussing more about Lancer as those details are planned out, and the 2024 conference we do know is going to occur between the 22nd and the 24th in November. Larry will be part of it, so will I. But in the meantime, we're also on the lookout for the Oswald book, and any idea what we might discuss in 2 more weeks when you come back around, like every other Wednesday? Larry is with us.
I don't know if we talked about the Bay of Pigs as being like a mystery, a black hole, whatever. There's more to it. I think maybe we should talk about Mexico City and the JFK assassination, Chuck, because I mean, if we started started this one, that's another good place to go into mysteries.
True enough. And just as a teaser to that, I'll tell you this. The first time I heard about Mexico City and all that, scary thing. Do you know where that was? I mean, you have an idea about my history with what I've studied, where I've been through in the literature and stuff I've done in research. Where do you think I first actually learned about Mexico City and Oswald and all that?
Oh, goodness. Peter Dale Scott?
No, you would think it would be something good like that, right? It's kind of laughable. I saw that mock trial, right, which made it to America a little bit after, because they did it in 86, and I got really interested. My interest begins in 88, you understand. Around there, I mean, I was mildly interested, but around the 25th anniversary, because of all the media attention, it drew my eye to the JFK assassination particularly. And I'm watching that mock trial, and what did, one of the lawyers decided to call up this guy, Ed Lopez.
Oh, yeah.
And it was funny because Ed Lopez comes on the stand there in this mock trial, which, later on I learned how ridiculous this thing was. But I thought I was watching, something really, really incredibly insightful because it was real witnesses, right? And, Bugliosi's supposed to be America's lawyer and all that, and Jerry Spence is involved, and they're using real jurors from Dallas, and they were pretending they were in a Dallas courtroom. Turns out they were actually in the UK. But anyway, all that's going on, and we're bringing real witnesses. And they brought this guy on who was an investigator for the House Select Committee, Ed Lopez. And this is all I knew. And there's Eddie Lopez. He's on the stand. And over again, he pretty much says, yeah, I can't talk about much of this. I mean, he's a witness who couldn't talk.
I give you my report, but I can't talk about it. Yep.
Yeah, and I watched that, and I went, oh, that's got to be the good stuff. And I was not educated on the case at all. It was almost all brand new to me, Larry, and I just went, that's got to be the good stuff. And ever after, there is a serious learning curve there that I had to get on. But isn't that funny that that's the way I was kind of introduced?
Oh, that is. And I'm sure Ed would have liked to say more. I can picture him going, I can't talk about it, but if I could, I'd tell you not to believe any of them.
Yeah, maybe I'll include a link to that with tonight's show or whatever, but I think we should go over obviously we're going to have to talk about the Lopez report, which is written by Ed Lopez and Dan Hardaway. I think Mexico City would be great unless something else comes up in the news that might be more relevant to our discussion, because we could do Mexico City later. But 2 weeks from now, I'd love to cover Mexico City with you. So let's plan on that for now, tentatively. Let's pencil it in. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, guys. So in 2 weeks, hopefully Larry will be back with us, and we'll talk about Oswald in Mexico City and that debacle, chicanery that went on there. And why do I say that? Well, I guess you'll have to listen in 2 weeks and find out. In the meantime, Larry-Hancock.com, all of Larry's books, there are links to his books from that website, from the WordPress site, which is available. I'll give you the links to both in the show notes. And I thank you, Larry, for doing this with us once again. So
it's good to be here. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Absolutely. And hopefully you guys will be back with us as time turns on and we get closer to November in Dallas, because that's going to be an interesting one. But we'll get educated more and more with Larry Hancock every other week, as often as we can get him, and talk about Mexico City next time. In the meanwhile, I am merely Ochelli. All of you are indeed the effect. And by the way, I could certainly use any help that you want to kick forward, because I just got done paying some pretty big annual bills for Ochelli.com and the free podcast and all that. It's free to you guys, not to me. I am merely Ochelli. All of you are indeed the effect, and you can be more the effect if you make a contribution at the donate button on Ochelli.com. Be well.